I'm just going to give a brief introduction of Professor Shanti Parikh. Professor Shanti Parikh is going to give us a talk on a topic entitled Wives, Lovers, and Sex Workers, Feminist Imaginations of Desire in Racialized Global Capitalism. So a little about Professor Shanti Parikh. She's professor at the Department of Anthropology, Washington University in St. Louis, and the Associate Chair of African and African American Studies. She has courtesy appointments in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, Urban Studies and Policy, and the Institute of Public Health, and has helped start the Global Health and Environment track. Professor Parikh has spoken widely on gender and HIV and has served as an advisor to various policy and planning groups. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, health, and capitalism. She has conducted research for over 25 years in the Iganga region in Uganda, where she's particularly interested in the politics of interventions that emerge to manage, protect, and mold populations. Using ethnographic methods and individual narratives, she appreciates the tensions between economic precarity and people's everyday creative acts of survival, care, and resistance. She's currently writing an ethnography on Black masculinity along the Trans-Africa Highway based on over 20 years of research, and is involved in an ongoing research project on commercial sex and mobility in HIV hotspots in truck stops, fishing communities, and sugar growing regions in Uganda. So some of the work that Professor Parikh has been, some of her central publications include in 2020 at Ferguson, Still Afterlives of Black Death, Resistance and Joy, Copper Disc Collection with artists, activists, and scholars based on the Ferguson uprising against police killings of Black people in the US. In 2015, Regulating Romance, Youth Love Letters, Moral Anxiety, and Interventions in Uganda's Time of HIV. And then in 2009, The Secret, Love, Marriage, and HIV Risk, co-authored with Jennifer Hash, Holly Wadlow, Daniel Smith, Harriet Finney, and Constance Netherson. Quite the CV there. Professor Shanti Parikh, we're really privileged and honored to have you give us this public lecture today. We would have really loved to have you in Uganda. That was the original plan, but we all understand the global situation now. So you're most welcome to give your talk. This session is 1.5 hours, so would like to have also to engage with you about your work afterwards. So just leave us a few minutes to be able to do that. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I am going to, let's see, hopefully I won't lose anything. I'm going to share my screen. And just to warn you, as I told everyone here already, it is a bit longer than I had intended. So I am going to, instead of reading, I'm going to try to just talk through some of the slides so that it is, I keep at the length and the time. So let me at least pull up my script on this side in case. So, oops, sorry about that. Let's see. Okay, is that okay? All right. So before I begin, I would like to, I think going through what the world is going through and analyzing our data in such a condition, I always felt like I need to perform an act of intellectual honesty by providing some caveats of what is shaping my analysis, or what I'm calling my reading of the data, sort of my perspective. and how I'm filtering these narratives of intimacy and personal stories of the men and women with whom I've interacted and collected stories from and gotten to know for the last 25 years. So by readings and locations, I mean sort of an epistemology that's sort of shaping it. And in today's racialized world, I think that's the first one. So my first location is racialized violence, that I'm right near Ferguson. And so seeing what's going on in Uganda and around the world, and sort of this, the intensity of violence that's happening to brown and Black bodies is also sort of shaping how I'm thinking about some of what the violences that I'm seeing in sex work and try to put them into a more global point. My other one, and I'll go through these quickly, I didn't mean to elaborate on these, is the violence that we're seeing going on in the United States around white supremacy after 4 years of Trump, and sort of the demand that that's just their territory. But more recently, sort of acts of joy and acts of Black women's rising to the top. But I'm also very sympathetic to what's going on in Uganda. So I'm analyzing this data as I'm looking to see the bravery that people are going through there, and how bodies again are being put on the front line. And so these sort of ideas of bodies and violence and brownness just kept circulating as I was looking at my data. And then the final thing is this idea of Black resiliency that seems to keep emerging, both from the sex workers who I'm going to talk about, but also in all of these other sort of situations. So I wanted to at least start there, but I'm going to start with a quote. And the subtitle of my talk, I couldn't decide between Hot Flesh or the one I gave. So Hot Flesh was from a quote. It's like hot flesh, laughter. You can't resist it when you're out there, when you're out here, it's hot. And then nostalgic laughter. But it also causes a lot of problems. It follows you, you follow it. It drowns you, light laughter. It keeps things moving, but it can also make things stop. That is, if you don't manage it properly. A 32-year-old fisherman in Lake Victoria. Oops, sorry. Such unresolved tensions between death and pleasure, properly managed and uncontrolled desire, were regular themes in my interviews and daily conversations with men and women about their experiences, hopes, and frustrations with intimate and sexual relationships. In this talk about wives, lovers, and sex workers, I decided to foreground sex workers. For as I have come to appreciate, an understanding of sex work and sex workers, by its very position as the ever-present outcast in society's moral imaginary, painfully reveals the gendered realities and limitations of marriage, conjugality, matrimony, and other forms of long-term and quote-unquote legitimate coupling. In other words, sex work is imagined as the not marriage or not legitimate form of coupling. Therefore, an analysis of sex work, or the opposite of good coupling, is at its core ultimately a discussion about marriage. And an analogy is queer studies. Queer studies has probably told us more about heterosexuality than regular theories on sexuality. So it is sometimes these abnormal categories that become a challenge particularly because they occupy this space of reality that we choose to forget. So this talk is, again, it's gonna touch upon those, but I'm mainly gonna focus on sex work because I realized I couldn't fit all three into one talk. It is based on, as the person who introduced me had said, it's based on all of my work. It builds on all of it, but it's particularly interested. I'm using a set of research from 2016 to 2020. And to your point about the global pandemic, I was supposed to go back last year, but of course, one couldn't. And in terms of Iganga, and I'll just go through this quickly because everybody on the call knows about Iganga. It's primarily agrarian, although it has pockets of trading and small industries and a rising professional class. It's known as having very poor health outcomes. Increasingly, like much of Uganda, it's increasingly NGOized. So lots of NGOs sort of taking the role of the state. Lloyd Fowlers, who did work there in the 1950s, called marriage, quote unquote, unstable compared to other places in Uganda. It was patrilineal, patrilocal, polygamy, divorce. Later, when I did my first project, sometimes this instability was not a bad thing because women could, of course, leave a bad marriage. And there's, of course, an increasing religious conservatism going through, evangelical, born again, and certain conservative sects of Islam. The data and methods, again, I'll just go through this quickly just to let people know what I'm using. So not only the previous 25 years, but this particular data set are in-depth interviews with female sex workers and clients in those in hotspots, ancillary players who are the bar owners, pubs, middlemen, key informants such as HIV officials, local officials, and some participatory mapping, some participatory activities. So the participatory activities were particularly useful in illuminating at these different hotspots, people's own perceptions of commercial sex work and how that fit into the Trans-Africa Highway and the wider networks. And I'll talk about some of that later. And we did them according to gender groups. So men, women, sex workers, younger sex workers. And also stigma. This is a stigma chart where sex workers were ranking their associations, what they felt most stigmatized on, and then trend lines. Just so that if I refer to some of this data in the talk, people will have an idea. Participant characteristics. I didn't know how many public health people would be on, so I decided I would put this up just to show a little bit of the data. The average age of the sex worker that we interviewed was about 30 years old, so about 29, about the same for the male clients. Most of them had children, actually 2.2 children. The average age of selling sex formally, so these were women who considered themselves in the sex trade. It wasn't just transactional sex. It ranged between 6 months to 11 years, but was about 8 years. Something that I'll talk about is marital status. So most of the women had been married. Only 3% who were working in the hotspots had not ever been married. And you see the breakdown of that. And with the men, about the same in terms of years of buying sex and in terms of the proportion of who considered themselves married, although fewer of the men considered them married. It was much harder to find male clients to interview than it was sex workers. So I would love to talk about that a little later. I took that part out of the talk. So a lot of the literature on sex work, particularly when it comes to HIV and sort of interventions, is looking at sex work as harmful to women, which I'm not denying it's not. It looks at it as a violation, against rights and dignity, violence, STDs. And in doing so, it doesn't fully account for some of the wider contours and networks and values and meanings that some of the sex workers' lives are actually embedded in. So the proposed conceptual framework is commercial sex environment, moral economy, and disposable bodies. And these are some concepts that I would like to explore. Pushes and pull. This is background to why women and men sort of enter into the sex trade. So for women, I'll just put up some quotes. After my husband chased me, I went to my brother to ask for a piece of our family land. He told me to sell the land that I have, my vagina. So I came here after a friend told me. Many of these stories from women that we talked to were revolved around the inheritance, that women didn't inherit land, that they didn't have access, and that still the main route of revenue was through men, was through their husbands. And even if they got it that way, the money still belonged to men. So another one, once they're in sex trade, we ask, what do they spend their money on? And the sex workers were just like mothers all around. They were interested in being dutiful daughters, so sending a lot of their money back to their parents, as well as responsible mothers, even though they tried to hide their participation in the sex industry from these people. So she says, the most important expenditure I make is on my children. I have now bought them some animals. Those animals were sold, and now we have built a house for rent. I send money to my children and mother. I go and leave her some 40,000 shillings. Isn't that okay? And I'll talk about it later, but you can already see sort of the inflection of a form of guilt or a way of gaining reputation by still even overachieving in terms of her responsibilities. And the woman, these are not real pictures of the people who I'm speaking of. Mama Hope was well known in one of the landing sites, and this woman reflects on why she went to stay with Mama Hope at her lodge. I was lost with nothing to do. And she's talking about after she was pregnant and her father chased her from her home and she got married and then that didn't work. So when a friend called and told me about a woman named Mama Hope near the landing, the girls I saw from there were nicely dressed. They were so smart. I saved money to go to her. They said she helped another girl get a good job in Kenya. And she doesn't make us go to drunk men. And so for many women who we interviewed, going to the truck stops or the landing sites or the sugar plantations was a way of exiting a violent situation and entering into one that they actually felt was, even though the perception might be sex work is violent, and many of them thought so as well, they were at least in a network of other women and sometimes older women, so a fictive kinship situation. For men, their narratives revolved around boredom and extra money. There's nothing much to do out here. You drive all day, you get harassed by patrols, you stop for petrol, to bathe, to eat, you have a little cash. After a few drinks, the girls are so beautiful. Another something that emerged, and again, I'm sorry that I'm reading from my slides, I'm trying to go quickly, is the changing of the marriage market. And this is where the global economy is moving faster than the economy in Uganda. So what people are seeing as aspirational is not what their pocketbooks can handle, nor can the Ugandan economy. Women are too expensive these days. Marriage, even girlfriends demand things. How can a man survive like that? Malayas are cheaper and don't argue. Malaya, of course, being Swahili for a sex worker. And then another man says, instead of getting another wife, whenever I am in need of sex, I just go get a sex worker, finish my problem, and our marriage continues. And these were probably not too, but again, the dynamic between marriage and the necessity of sort of the role that sex work plays. So with that, I wanted to broaden it out. That's looking closely at what pushes and pulls men and women into the sex trade. But I'm also interested in the broader sex environment. So not only sex workers and their customers, as well as the dependents they support, but I was interested in what is revealed if we look at them as embedded in a wider economic structure that includes the communities around these hotspots, that include places up and down the Trans-Africa Highway. And once we scale out, we see a very different sort of perception of sex work. And that's what I call the moral paradox. All right, let's see. So when placed in a wider environment, the moral paradox emerges. I use moral paradox to capture the contradictory ways in which commercial sex fits in with the community system of social meanings and moral values. It's paradoxical because the sex trade is deemed immoral, and yet it is simultaneously serves as has a recognized function, both economically and socially. I think this might be on the slide. Okay, there we go. Furthermore, the buying and selling of sex should not necessarily be conceptualized as irrational risk-taking or doing something immoral. Rather, our data shows commercial sex work can be understood as emerging from and existing within a context of failures of the perceived traditional economic system that are no longer able to support its vulnerable members, and maybe it could never. So when we use these ideas, we can see sex work as emerging as something that is immoral, but a lot of the people that we interviewed, even the local leaders, talked about it as a way of serving a benefit. Local council member for a cluster of islands in Lake Victoria, fishermen attract women. Some sell sex, others sell merchandise, and they make lots of money. There's a lot of money in supply around different stakeholders. But the real change has been the influx of sex workers. That has created an economic boom. Now that women are here, we have lodges, permanent homes, secondhand clothing markets, food stalls, malois, and pubs. These men, you see, men are fine sleeping in fishing boats, eating what they find, drinking local brew. The islands were primitive. But now that there are women, he says, laughing, women spend money on food, lodging, and just to be comfortable. Sex workers entice fishermen to bars, pool halls, lodges. They have come off their boats. Now fishermen stay in lodges where sex workers live. The economy here is good with them. And again, this is somebody who's supposed to be sort of the local leader of the area. And this tension is something that we constantly found. So we were in one site when an HIV sort of team came by, and it was very interesting after the HIV team left to sort of talk to people and participants about commercial sex work, because of course people there wanted to be safe, but it also served a real economic pull. So the economic relief, it opens up markets. There's an ancillary market. It helps support an entire economy. It's not just about the sex trade. It's about the pubs. This woman is drying fish. They send it back to the rural areas. And as he said, having girls here is good for our town. Another moral paradox we found is the idea of social relief. Social relief, let's see, do I have anything up here? Let's see. Oh, okay. So I'll give an explanation afterwards. Sex workers save men with high libido from straying into rape and defilement, as well as bestiality. Would you be okay with raping a person, yet prostitutes are available? And another, rape cases here have reduced. I do not properly know, but automatically people would say, why didn't he go and buy a prostitute instead of raping a child or raping an animal? So I can say that sex business here has minimized rape and other sex crimes. I just want to emphasize, I am just quoting people. I mean, I'll talk about the complications of that sort of thinking at the end. So this whole concept of social relief, that it keeps marriage happy, keeps crime lows, is predicated on this also idea, this unstated assumption about, or a reality of gender inequality. The idea that there's this category of women who can serve the role of somebody who can be done unto. It's also about the idea we kept hearing about men can't afford wives or girlfriends. One elderly man said, now that men can't get married, women are suffering because now they don't have access to money. So sex work is a way to give them access to men's money. So this whole idea of social relief is also exposing something about the dynamics of gender inequality, but also of the changes in marriage market. So one of the important findings we found is that the sex workers, so these little blue spots are truck stops that we did work in. sex workers, if you're a truck stop sex worker, you're going to stay along the truck stops and you're going to move up and down the truck stops. So mobility became a way of protection, but also a way of knowing where money was. So there was a network that would call people where the money was, where the truck stops were, and the truckers would know where the young women were, and they had, of course, different words for describing vaginas, but where the juicy ones were. And so it was almost like it was this communication infrastructure, and the islands was the same. One of the men we talked to was explaining how we know where to go fishing because of the sex workers. And so it was the sex workers who were telling the men, because the sex workers would have male clients. They would find information out. So the sex workers were also the holders of very valuable information. So they were embedded into these systems. And if you're a sex worker in the islands, which are here, you would stay in the islands. And if you were here, you would stay there. So these networks would form a sort of protection. So when we conceptualize sex work as being brutal, and the team that I was talking about that were coming by trying to intervene in sex work, we have to keep in mind that for some women, these are a form of protection because they have been cast away from their marital family or even from their parents' home. So one woman says, or one sex worker says, "The bar owner where I used to sell from never mistreated me. This was because she knew that a sex worker pays for the room and brings customers to her bar, and she used to like and value that sex worker. She also knew that sex workers attract customers in her bar. In my previous bar where I used to do sex business, we were over 30 prostitutes staying within that bar. And whenever any customer stole money from the prostitute, we would report it. And the bar owner, and this would be solved immediately. A bar owner in Busia, which is, as you all know, the border town, used to counsel and guide us prostitutes. She never disrespected us. She was our aunt, our mother." And again, I won't read it from my paper, but this was a theme that constantly emerged. The tension between feeling very like the women had this fictive kinship, had this support that they had never had before, but then also engaging in an industry that they did not always, this was not their first choice. All right, I'm going to skip down to a big part of my argument, which is this idea of disposable bodies. Let's see if I can. Okay, so disposable bodies is trying to reflect this idea that of this moral paradox and the role that women or sex workers are playing in it, and the role that stigma plays in it. So she says, "I look down because of three things: sex work, HIV positive status, and not being married." So she has all three. And some of them used to call them the triple, they used to have all these interesting words for it, the triple braid, the triple helix, what I hate most is being a sex worker. Selling myself causes disrespect. People in society do not respect a person in the sex work. As a sex worker, you are considered an animal who can sleep with any man. And this sort of disposability, this sort of disposability gave way to certain sorts of violences that women experienced. They became, I think this might be my next slide. Okay. Sorry about this, that was not supposed to be there. So for women, the moral paradox converted these bodies into disposable bodies to help accommodate, for society to be able to help accommodate this tension. So even though they were needed, they were also the source of ridicule and the source of, one sex worker talked about when people got drunk, they would spit on her. So they became this source of violence. And even for the male sex work, even for male customers. So for sex worker, violence, despised. Male clients would talk about this kind of disposability as showing up differently. They would talk about, and they had fluctuating networks, they would talk about it impacting their ability to access services. So some of the global health messages as truckers and mobile men as being the carriers of HIV, what we found was people that we would interview at some of the health clinics had incorporated these messages about risk and about transmission. And for them, it was these mobile men, it was men's fault. And this is one of the places, and those of you, of course, in Uganda know this, this is one of the places where you first go to these public education sessions before you get your HIV meds. And many of the men talked about not wanting to go there because they didn't want to be outed. Because if you're a man with HIV, the implication is that you're bad. If you're a woman with HIV, as the woman earlier said, it seemed that you might have gotten it from one of these philandering men. And these are USAID funded, which is of course the logic, neoliberal logic of trying to service as many people for the least amount of money and what that does to confidentialities. So where the racialized global economy comes in, because I haven't talked about that yet. So my particular interest in situating commercial sex work in these hotspots is primarily the global economy and the racialized economy. So Africa being a place still of extractive resources, and the sites that we worked on were part of the global extractive economy, where the entire Africa becomes a disposable body. And these, I'll just quickly talk about it. This is we weren't allowed to go in, but they said we could take a picture. This is a Chinese built facility that was getting gallbladders from the fish in Lake Victoria to export them. And as a result, the fishermen, the petty fishermen, were being squeezed out, being paid less, and were being beaten. So many times when sex workers, what they were paying sex workers were going down, the men were being beaten, they were getting drugs. So it caused this entire sort of situation. So I guess my argument here is that in order to understand what is going on, we also have to understand what's being extracted and the entire region, how that is being conceptualized. So I guess my main point, I'm just going to read, how much more time do I have? Can I still, do I have time to at least read this part? Okay, so sex work, violence, and stigma and shame are not failures of the local gendered moral economy or of the marriage imaginary. Rather, it is precisely what allows it to stay intact in a region where economic opportunities for both men and women are so few, or at least they're unable to meet they're not able to meet their desires of being an active part of the global economy and modern marriage. Being left out of the global and local economies is particularly violent to women in a setting where women don't have access to what is considered the most reproductive resource, land. And they're being told to, as the one woman was told by her brother, to sell what you have. And they have to do it at risk of, and they do it at risk of losing support from their networks in search of another form of networks and the violence that it comes with it. The socially rendered immorality of sex workers is used to justify the violence, stigma, and shame that sex workers endure. Essential to the moral paradox is the notion that this behavior is not a failure of, okay, I already read that, sorry. As a form of social relief, the industry not only provides an essential income for sex workers, but it also is perceived as a deterrent for rape, bestiality, pedophilia, and other sexual immoralities, offering a social relief to men who cannot afford the cost of romantic relationships. So again, the idea that this is becoming the spot and disposability where things can be gained. At the same time, female sex workers face stigma and shame, leading them to engage in a concealment and mobility reputation management strategies. So they go up and down the Trans-Africa Highway once it might be found out that they're HIV positive or once there's jealousy that brews up. So this constant mobility that is pulling them from their newly found networks increases their exposure to HIV and violence. This suggests that sustainable HIV risk reduction strategies should consider how sex work and sex workers fit into not only the local economy, but the broader geography of sex work and the social moral worlds and gender meanings. So my first things I would like to emphasize, I think that was my last slide. Yeah, just some other pictures. So first, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can just read this part. Okay. So what I'm first suggesting is that the whole idea of the moral paradox needs to be considered as a pathway of risk, and that as a pathway of risk, people will try to find ways to balance out sort of this moral economy. And the first pathway is women trying to seek by caring the reputations by caring for their children and families, and condomless sex, of course, which has been written about. And although sex work is considered shameful, women are pushed into it because of the social system that has failed to support them. Sex work, violence, and stigma are sort of built into this imaginary and are situated in this larger global economy that renders Africa still a place that can be extracted. And at the losing end of this are these mobile sex workers who are trying to gain entry into a global economy without resources or land to access it. And they risk the violence that comes from it. So I will stop there because I think I was only to go, I think I didn't want to go over. So